When I was a kid, I used to love watching behind the scenes featurettes on like DVDs and stuff. You know, those little mini documentaries where they would show you how they did some sort of like special effects, or they would show you how they filmed a scene or how they built some set or something. But I was a music kid, so the ones that were the most fun to watch, the ones that I watched over and over and over again, were those ones like this, where they would show somebody recording real music for a movie. John Williams in front of a full orchestra with a big screen, all the time code, and I didn't like it necessarily for all the visual spectacle, but because John Williams would talk about his philosophy and like how he put the score together and like what his thoughts were about it, or maybe James Horner or somebody. Um, and so when I was approached to do this presentation, that was the first thing I thought about was like I could kind of put something together like that, where we would talk a little bit about the philosophy behind the big game I just worked on, Halo Infinite. We talk about how we put it together. The other thing I immediately thought about was all the emails I get from young composers who want to get into, maybe film or games or something, and they want to know, how do you do it? And what is your advice on how to get into that industry? And so I thought maybe what we could do is put together a hybrid presentation that kind of addressed both those topics, that looked at the philosophy of the score that we put together and gave some examples of things that we'd done, but also that did it through the lens of my experience working on a big giant AAA game for the first time, and what advice I would have for people who are trying to get into it. So hopefully that's a helpful set of topics, and that's what we're going to cover. So a little bit about me. I'm Curtis Schweitzer. I'm a game composer. Um, Most people know my work and me from Starbound, which was a 2014 indie game, pixel art, side-scrolling, procedural-generated sci-fi game, for which I wrote around 6 hours, I think, of music, 5 hours, something like that. Um, that has had a lot of success, and we've been fortunate enough to be pretty popular in the music too. So that's where most people know me from. I've done some other games. I've done this is one called Interstellar Rift. It is a sort of space sandbox Minecraft build your own spaceship, pseudo, I guess, almost like MMO sometimes. Anyway, that's a really fun game. It's one that I worked on. I've also worked on some other indie stuff like this airships game where you design and build these steampunk airships and fight them. Pretty fun. I've also done some work on some VR games. This is a VR game called Earthlight, where you put on the VR headset and you sort of simulate what it's like to be an astronaut on the International Space Station. My music background obviously goes back a little bit before these. I started composing thinking I would be like a concert composer. I thought I would be like writing notes down on paper that I would then get printed and hand to performers, and they would perform them at concerts and things. So I went the whole route that you would do if you were wanting to do that. I went to college and got a degree and stuff. Um, and when I get people who want to know how you make that transition, like how do you change from being somebody who's just writing music for music's sake into writing for something like a game, like what are some pieces of advice that you have? And I think the most important piece of advice is to write every day as much as possible. I know this isn't like technically possible, and this is advice that I give to people that I myself cannot possibly follow, but to the extent possible, if you can put down notes on paper or into a digital audio workstation every single day, even just a little bit, it helps you hone your skill. I liken this to like practicing piano, right? Like you would never expect to not practice piano or not touch a piano for months on end and somehow be able to be good at piano. It's the same with composition. You just have to do it a lot to be good at it. So the number one thing and the first piece of advice I always give people is to write every day. Now, as far as getting into the game industry, like what is the best way in? I don't know. I can tell you that my initial way in was working on mods. I worked on a modding project for Skyrim called the Middle-earth Role-Playing Project, MERP. Uh, it was a community of people that were trying to do a total conversion of the game from one about, the Skyrim universe to a Lord of the Rings game. So they needed music that sounded Lord of the Ringsy in their game. So I volunteered on the project to come in and do that for them. So that was how I initially got into like interactive writing, was doing that. And I think that's a good introduction because although often, it's a volunteer thing because it's just a bunch of people doing something that they want to do, it's a safe place to kind of do it for the first time. It's a safe place to make mistakes because everybody's often new. It's often people's first time making art and writing. And it's just a really nice environment. So that's a good way in. Another good way in is to do as much as you can to work on short films. This is just a screenshot of a working cut, obviously, of a short film that I had done a while back. It's a great process. It's surprising when you get into writing for an actual game how much a cutscene and a short film are the same thing. It teaches you timing. It teaches you how to stay with the picture. It teaches you how to evoke different moods. So that can be a really, really great way, to get into the industry. And then, of course, indie games are also really useful. A lot of them are going to look like this. They're going to be pixel art things that people are putting together because they love to make games. They love to be developers. This is a great way to meet people. This is, a lot of games that I work on have a small team of people who will then disperse, and then they might end up on other teams, and then they remember that I helped them with Project X, and so now they're on Project Y, and even though it's a completely different team, they've brought me along. So this can be a great way to get into the industry, and there's just so much space for indie games right now that there's just a lot of need for people to work on them. Overall, this brings me to the second piece of advice, which is just to say yes. Say yes to as many things as possible. The video you're watching right now is an example of me actually following my own advice. I've never been asked to give a presentation like this. This is my first time doing it. Hopefully that's not hugely obvious. But the more you can get experience doing these things, the more you will develop your skills and the more you will be able to, just be used to working in this environment. So saying yes can be really important. When I was first hired on Halo, one of the questions I asked them was like, how did you find me? Like, I'm just kind of, I'm just an indie composer. Like, how did you find my stuff? And they said, well, we had heard some of your music from Starbound and we liked it. And we thought that style would be good for our project. And also we had heard this track called Persephone. And I was like, Persephone? That's weird. That's from a short film I worked on. It's a really small project. I don't know how many people have even seen the movie. I mean, it's probably less than 100 people have even seen the movie. I published the soundtrack on Spotify, but, I know very few people listen to that because I can see it. It's weird that you would run across that. And I said, well, we did, and we thought it sounded good for our project. So for me, how I got into the industry, it was indie games plus short films. Your equation might look something very different from this. It might not have, this is obviously simplified too, right? Like it's really not 2 steps. It's really, the 100 steps before Starbound off to the left here or off to the right, depending on how you're looking at this before that. But, this is how it worked out for me. So I think that kind of goes back to that theme of saying yes as much as possible and just being open to working on things. So that's my advice kind of to young composers as far as getting into stuff and getting into games and how I got into games. Let's talk a little bit about a meaty subject, Halo Infinite. Let's talk about Master Chief. So when I was initially brought on to Halo Infinite, the very first assignment that I was given was to score a trailer called Discover Hope. This was their 2019 E3 trailer. And immediately, the big changes in the differences between working on smaller stuff like a Starbound or something and working on a big AAA. This is where they first started popping up. And the first big difference that I would say to think about as you're trying to get into games is working with large teams. You know, on Starbound, I was essentially the music department. It was like me, right? Like they could have just, this is my home office, I could have just put Starbound music department on the door, and because it's just me. I was choosing how everything worked. I was putting everything together. You know, it was just me. But on Halo, it's beautiful because I'm working with a music supervisor, 𝘚𝘵𝘢𝘵. I'm working with a narrative director. I'm working with an audio director. You know, people above them get feedback. So working with large teams is great because there's so many people, you know, there to just help you shape everything into what it needs to be. But that really does mean being willing to take that feedback and to revise the things that you're sending them to. So going back sort of to advice for younger composers and for people who want to do this, practice revising your work now. I had revised my work before Halo, of course. I do different drafts of things, and I would routinely get feedback from, you know, short film directors or whatever. But the amount of revising you do when it's on a project this big is really, really a lot larger in scale. Just it requires you to do things that you haven't done before. So this is something you can practice as an audio person, as a composer. You can practice revising your work. Open up a cue that you really like or a piece of music you really like. Look at the middle section, like say, you know, the middle third of it, and say, what happens if I have to cut this entire middle third, leave the first third and the last third the exact same, and completely rewrite the middle? Like, what would that be like? And practice the skills that you need to do that. Even the simple skills of, how do I do this in my DAW? How do I cut that out without everything turning into a giant mess? Practice that. Learn how to do it, because you're going to be doing it a lot if you end up at the AAA level. So another topic that I think is worth talking about is the difference between composing for orchestra and composing for orchestra. This became really apparent as soon as I started working on the Discover Hope trailer. You know, obviously this is going to be recorded. Obviously we're going to take this down to Nashville, you know, put some players in front of some mics and record the music. But I talked about before how I was from a concert background. You know, I thought of composing for orchestra like this. This behind the screen here is a Mahler symphony, where, you know, I write the notes down on the piece of paper. Everybody gets together. We play from bar one to the end, and we're done. That's what I thought of composing for orchestra as. You know, I had obviously done other composition for samples, which is maybe more about composing for orchestra. But even when you're talking about recording an orchestra, it's so very different than this. So very different. Because fundamentally, you're taping together a bunch of takes that you're going to do, and you want them all to coherently work together, you know, just in terms of sounding like they were recorded for the same piece of music. But also, this gives you more flexibility. If I was composing for orchestra, notice the music behind, if I was doing this where I'm writing something that needs to be performed live, I can't have a transition where, say, you know, the string section needs to switch from pizzicato, plucked, to bowed, arco, really, really fast, because I need to give them time to change, maybe pick up a bow, maybe just switch how they're playing. But when I'm composing for orchestra, I can do that because I can just record the pizzicato part and then stop, and then record the arco part and stitch it together. So it's not all downside. It's just a different way of thinking. Another thing about composing for orchestra, as in for recorded stuff, is that you have to remember that because there's so much flexibility that they have in taking the music apart once it's been recorded, you have to write interesting things that aren't just interesting horizontally, they have to be interesting vertically. You want to write as much interesting line as you can, so that if they want to take the cello and bass parts out by themselves, they can do that. They can pull them out and they work as standalone. And to the extent that you can give them material like that, that's going to make their job a lot easier and make them more likely to hire you in the future. So keep that in mind if you're a young composer and you want to get into this. How do I write interestingly vertically and interestingly horizontally at the same time? So let's talk a little bit about scoring Halo as a game. Let's do some behind the scenes stuff. So our overall philosophy in putting this together was respecting the past and making something new, or something akin to this. We wanted this score to really feel like it sat nicely with, especially the original Halo trilogy. We wanted to really make sure that we really wanted that to be a priority in the score. But at the same time, we're not just remixing old stuff, right? Like, we want to bring something new to the past. So let's talk about a little bit about the ins and outs of how we did that. I'm going to use some examples from some stuff that I put together. And the overall thing that I felt like made this work was this notion of like thematic coherence. This is kind of the phrase I use instead of, you may have heard Marty O'Donnell uses the term emotional equity. I prefer the term thematic coherence because I think of it as more of like a structure of sort of pillar themes that you need to set up correctly in order to sort of build the building of music, right, and have it not fall down under its own weight, especially in a franchise that is now 6 games long. So, it's important to note that all 3 composers who worked on the project, myself, Gareth Coker, and Joel 𝘚𝘚𝘭𝘰 all used this, I would say, and I certainly can hear in their music definite attention to this, and I think this was definitely a priority throughout the whole project. The examples I'm going to give are just from a couple of cues that I've worked on, that I wrote, but I would be remiss not to note how well my fellow co-composers on the project had done this as well. So let's talk a little bit about the cue Zeta Halo. So on screen, I've got the new melody that we decided to use in Zeta Halo. I'm just going to play it on a keyboard here real fast. It sounds like this. So when we were approaching the idea of the monk chant, the choir piece, we wanted to have, obviously, the monk chant from Halo CE, but also this new melody, right? We wanted this new material to be in there. So in constructing this new material, we were really careful to try to use the old as a guide for what was coming now. So you can see that here. Here's the original monk chant. Ignore that I have notated it in a very strange way. It's actually helpful because you can see that it builds a structure, right? We've all heard this. Sorry. So there is the original monk chant. Now, structurally, let's think about it. How is it laid out? Well, we sort of have between 3 and 4, probably more likely 4 statements, right, that evolve over time. We have the first statement. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. For my purposes, I think the last two kind of merge into one. It's actually kind of one of the brilliant things about it, I think, is that it kind of surprises you by not having a break there. So I think of it as more like three statements. And that's kind of what we ended up with, right? We ended up with this, statement one. Two. There's a couple of analogies that I use in my own headcanon, I guess, for how this is. I sort of think of it as like maybe like a road, right? Like we want our road to go to the same towns, but we want to take a different route, I guess, is kind of how I thought about this. So in order to do that, we need to go to the same places. We need to go to the same towns, right? And so this melody tries to do that. It tries to go to the same towns. When it ends, when it cadences here, in the third measure there, where that F sharp is, it's kind of cadencing in kind of the same way. And then in its second iteration, it's really hammering home that Dorian scale, right? By adding that sixth degree. Right? That's the halo sound, right? That beautiful raised sixth degree is so important to that sound. And so it really hammers that home in the second phrase, just like the monk chant does, right? Sorry. There we go. So in this case, you want to think about it, I guess, as like the structure was defined by the old, and we're just kind of filling that structure with new material. We're sort of, we're sort of filling it out with something new, a new idea. Another thing that we wanted to do here is to expand sort of the texture, the sonic palette, the tone color of this piece. So there's been a lot of halo chants over the years that have used, all four sections of the choir: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. But we really wanted to, or at least I wanted to, really emphasize that. And the way I thought about it was, if the original monk chant is kind of that monophonic medieval sound, I wanted it to almost be a little bit more like a Renaissance sound. So maybe a little bit more polyphony, a little bit more multiple melodies at the same time concurrently, right? And of course that means building up that texture even more. So later when this piece, Zeta Halo, when it quotes that monk chant, we have a very clear, in the upper two lines, double melody happening. Right. I really wanted to emphasize that notion of like continued motion. So that's why, for example, at the writ, when the sopranos hold on that B, we still have that other melody happening underneath it, which is taken from the chant to continue to preserve that thematic coherence, to, keep everything really, really centered on those ideas. So that's another way we kind of did it. So that's kind of taking the old and maybe trying to dress it up a little bit differently. I love this moment, just as a personal note, this moment in the second measure, the fourth beat here, where the sopranos are on a B. We've got this A chord underneath. There's no actual A in the chord, but then the altos do it, and it's right next to the soprano note. It's one of my favorite parts of that track, so I was pretty proud of that. So another example in a different cue. Let's talk a little bit about other ways that we approached this. So here's Never Tell Me the Odd. This is an action cue that happens a little bit later in the game. During the sort of exploratory process where we were kind of putting together sketches and suites to kind of see, like, how do we want this to sound? Like, what are some ideas we can bring? I had written this little piece in 7/8, and it was based on this little melody. Oops. That was terrible. Hold on. I should practice my piano more. Okay. They were very, very nice to me. If I was the music supervisor and someone brought to me a 7/8 cue like this, I would have said, this could be a nightmare to record. I don't want to do it. You are not allowed, write it. And so, but they were very nice, and they said, okay, let's write this. Let's do this. We'll do this fun thing. And the amount of audio editing that we had to do to piece together this whole thing, because it's pretty complex rhythmically at times, was really wonderful. And I just wanted to take this moment to note how much I appreciate all of the audio editing work that was done in this. And if you listen to the soundtrack, you can really hear how well they put it together. So another example, by the way, of composing for orchestra versus composing for orchestra. This would be probably pretty hard to perform. Nevertheless, talking about this melody and how we integrate it into sort of the past, how we show that respecting the past part of it. This melody, first of all, is very Halo in its construction. So it's based around this notion of leaps. It's always jumping down, back down to that lower note, just like. It's based around those same 3 notes. Actually it goes up one more, just like. Additionally, one of the things that we really wanted to do was to really emphasize groove. And really feel like you're kind of in a groove when you're in it. It's one of the things that so much of the Halo music that came before us does so well. You really bop in your head to it. So we have this kind of really cool alternating 3/4 pattern. 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1. 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2, which I feel like really kind of gets your head bobbing. So I was pretty proud of that. Now, when I had initially given this sketch, it had this kind of this accompaniment. I find that when writing in asymmetrical time signatures, it's really important to keep the beat groupings really clear, right? Like you don't want to have, you don't want to be, you just want to know that this is, for example, 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. So I had these chords like hammering away against that melody in the original sketch. And our music supervisor, 𝘚𝘵𝘢𝘭𝘪𝘵, was giving me some feedback one day, and he said, you know what that really sounds like? It really reminds me of On a Pale Horse, which has this, it's in, like, I think, like 12/8, what is it? And it plays the Halo theme under it and all that stuff. So what we decided to do with this melody was to take that texture, that idea, that opening from On a Pale Horse. We're going to change the time signature. We put it in 7/8 instead of, I think, 12/8 is what it's originally in. And that's how we open the piece. Respecting the past, but then going somewhere new with it, right? Starting with something that is familiar, but extending it and taking it in, hopefully in a direction that's new, hopefully in a direction that is interesting. So those are just a couple of examples of sort of like actual, like technical, how the gears come together level detail of how we were sort of approaching that philosophy and how it ends up manifesting itself in the score. Obviously, you can hear this approach everywhere, all over the entire score. You can hear it in Gareth's music, you can hear it in Joel's music. It's not just remix, it's respecting the past and doing something new. So that was my experience working on it. That's just a little window into it. That's just a little chance for me to talk on the little documentary that I'm making to show a little peek behind the curtain. So I want to thank the festival organizers, Marius, I believe, for inviting me to put this presentation together. It was certainly very flattering to have someone ask me to be a part of this, and I jumped at the opportunity. And of course, thank you for watching. I hope it's been useful for you.